Okay, welcome everyone to today's event, What a Trump Administration Means for U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East. My name is Jessica Winiger, and I am the director of Northwestern's Middle East and North African Studies program. I am delighted to welcome our expert guests from the Center for International Policy and the Brookings Institution and many other institutions that they are or have been a part of, Drs. Nancy Okail and Shibley Telhami, as well as Matthew Duss. They have come to share their perspectives on what we might expect in the coming days, weeks, months, and years for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. There have been a flurry of dramatic events related to the region since President Trump took office just 2.5 weeks ago, not the least of which is the stunning announcement this week that the U.S. would take control of Gaza and forcibly displace the Gazan population. This announcement comes on top of numerous others, such as a stoppage of all U.S. foreign aid in the region and around the world, except military aid to Egypt and Israel, a plan to permanently withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria, a plan for Saudi Arabia that it would invest $600 billion in the U.S. during Trump's term in order to intensify sanctions on Iran, moves towards a renewal of the Muslim ban, and plans to deport international students who participated in protests. Our guests today have decades of experience studying U.S.-Middle East relations and so are well positioned to help us understand these events and the shifting contours of U.S. foreign policy. So they will speak for about 45 minutes in a dialogue, and then we will move to Q&A. Before I introduce them, I would like to thank the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs and the Department of Political Science for co-sponsoring this event, and all of our staff members who made this event possible. So we are pleased to have with us Dr. Nancy Okail. Okail is the president and CEO of the Center for International Policy. She is a leading scholar, policy analyst, and advocate with more than 20 years of experience working on issues of human rights, democracy, and security in the Middle East and North African region. She previously served as a visiting scholar at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University, and as executive director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, which under her leadership became an internationally renowned policy research organization. We also welcome Dr. Shibley Telhami. Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development, Distinguished Scholar Teacher, and Director of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Poll. He is also non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Telhami is the author and editor of numerous books. He recently co-edited The One-State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine, which was published in 2023 with Cornell University Press. And there's a current book in the works called Peace Derailed, Obama, Trump, Biden, and the Decline of Diplomacy on Israel-Palestine, 2011 to 2022. You may have to do an epilogue to that book. They will be joined by Matthew Duss, who will be moderating the conversation. Matthew Duss is Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Before joining CIP, Duss was a visiting scholar at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From 2017 to 2022, Duss was Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. From 2014 to 17, he was the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. And from 2008 to 14, he was a national security and international policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for the Institute and for Northwestern for inviting us to speak, and thank you all for being here and those joining online for watching. So as you heard, my two colleagues are doctors. I'm not a doctor, which is why I have to moderate. So stay in school, get your PhD, you get to be on the panel. So, I mean, not a lot going on in the Middle East with Trump, so really hard to think, what are we going to talk about? But no, this has been an eventful week, to say the very least, and not in a good way. Why don't we start with just a basic question? I mean, I think Trump signaled a lot. We have a first term to go on. We kind of know where Trump is coming from, but Trump and his team had 4 years to come up with new and more detailed plans, knowing a lot more about how to use the instruments of government, the bureaucracy, and where the pressure points are. Can we start with you? From what we've seen thus far in just the first few weeks, and it seems like the last few weeks are the longest year of my life, but what can we tell so far about what we might expect in the coming weeks and years.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to Northwestern for hosting us. I may want to just start a little bit with some perspective, which is put aside Trump for a minute, right? I mean, obviously this is about the Trump policy, but put him aside for a minute. This is a horrific, most challenging moment in the Middle East that I have ever experienced in all my decades, I should say, all my decades of scholarship on this issue. And so whoever even had Harris won the presidency, she would have inherited the same awful choices that we now have, a horrific reality. And the reality is that many of us, including, those of us who've been working on this and thinking that we have wisdom to bring to bear to figure out how we can propel ourselves out of this moment, we're scrambling for ideas. And when you add to this not only the limits of American foreign policy as we have witnessed it, not just under Republican administration, but also under Democratic administration, including the Biden administration, and you layer that with the kind of reality, particularly in Israel-Palestine, that is simultaneously heartbreaking and paralyzing, where you have so much devastation in Gaza. It's the kind of devastation that is being now used as an excuse for deportation, because you can't live there after it's been destroyed. And the Israelis who, after October 7, really were shaken, and obviously also paid a price, maybe heavier than they're admitting at the moment, for both the war in Gaza and the war in South Lebanon. And you have two fragile ceasefire agreements between Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Hamas. And you have almost all the parties that have been fighting seeing this essentially as an existential moment. I mean, because it's not just about it challenging what is policy, but they think of it as, if we don't do this or do that, we're no longer we're gonna cease to exist as we have existed. Therefore, it's really a zero-sum game. And we know what happens in those kind of moments. It becomes demonization of the other becomes, kind of the path. Lack of empathy with the other becomes the path. Conversation across becomes if one side gains, it comes at the expense of the other. And so we have this kind of environment where it's impossible even to have a debate or a dialogue or any kind of thought related to how we can propel ourselves forward. And the Biden administration did not help, let's be honest, with the way they conducted themselves in the past 4 years. So I just want to start with that, separate from Trump, that this is an incredibly challenging, painful moment that many of us were grappling with before Trump came to office. Now, with Trump, there are many things we knew about him. And I have studied him closely, meaning particularly his policy in the Middle East, because of a forthcoming book that is co-authored that we've been worked on and reviewed his performance on this issue very closely during the first term. And we knew a lot about him. I mean, it's not like the number one, and this is through interviews of his top aides, many of them, been in public, including national security advisors, chiefs of staff, as being the most uninformed president perhaps in American history, and to boot, the most uninterested in learning to the point that he just didn't even listen to intelligence briefs, and the most, as one of his top aides, his top Russia aide, Fiona Hill, put it in her book, the most exquisitely manipulable president to the detriment of him personally and to the detriment of the interests of the United States of America. So all of that we knew about him. There was no shocker, the fact that he really doesn't know what he's talking about. And everybody knew that when he takes a public position, even if it's proven 120% to be wrong, he never backtracks and he doubles down. And therefore, if you're going to manipulate him, that's the way to do it, is to just drag him into taking a public posture early on something, and then he's not gonna go away. And we have many examples, by the way, in the forthcoming book of such incidents that happened during the first administration. So all of that was already in our information bag. We knew what to expect from him. I still was absolutely astonished to watch and listen to what he said last Tuesday after his meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was utterly shocking. Utterly shocking, even as I understood who this man is and what he is capable of doing. It was extraordinary that he may not have been fully even aware that what was he advocating adds up to ethnic cleansing. Now, he didn't use the term forcible, by the way, with regard to the displacement of Palestinians. Let's be clear. He said they would want to do it, but all of them would go. And of course, how are you going to get all of the people to go? And of course, if they end up going anyway because they have nothing left, it's a consequence of what happened to them, the devastation. But that's just not coming to full grips with the meaning of that. Or for that matter, the idea that the U.S. would send troops to take over Gaza, to own Gaza, even as the word own, we would own it. We would own Gaza initially. Obviously, it's a little backtracking. The illegality of that under international law, the impracticality, all of that was not discussed. So the idea that you'd start with that anyway, shooting yourself in the foot, not only in the international public, look at the international response from everybody, allies and foes alike, rejected the idea, including people he really needs, like, for example, the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Jordanians, who are now lining up essentially against him. But more importantly, the very ceasefire agreement that he had helped, in fact, broker. Yes, he did. I mean, while in transition, the Biden administration essentially gave him the space to work on the ceasefire agreement because they wanted him to own it, not just say this is Biden's doing. And in fact, he owns it. He took credit for it. He said it would not have happened. He wants it to be fulfilled. But if you're telling Hamas that, all I want is to get the hostages out, but afterwards, we're going to go out in full war, destroy you with American help, and then expel all the Palestinians, or at least find a way to displace them, and then take it over, what incentive does Hamas have to continue with the ceasefire agreement? I mean, what is the point of the agreement when it's an agreement for both sides? The idea that you're giving something, you're taking something. Honestly, I find it to be ultra shocking, and it's probably because now he's so super empowered that he doesn't feel the need to talk to anybody anymore, to be restrained by anything anymore. And I think that that's just opens up so many different possibilities that we didn't anticipate even just 3 weeks ago.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it's a hard act to follow. I mean, whenever like Shibley speaks, and I fully agree with him, and that's a good thing because just in the street, someone disagreed with me and we had a fight, and that's why I'm wrapped. No, really, it's nice. I think, I mean, I do agree with Shibley, with everything he said. I just want to have a disclaimer at the beginning of this conversation to say, I mean, like, nothing that I would say would in any way belittle the danger that Trump is bringing to democracy, to the United States and the rest of the world. He's not, I mean, in any way in his corruption approach, I mean, matchable by anyone we know. Well, let's set that aside and let's see the world and the United States that Biden handed over to Trump. first of all, I mean, one of the biggest issues that we have with Trump is that, oh my God, he's going to destroy the rules-based world order, right? I mean, I don't think anyone who's been following Biden would not, I mean, see and recognize how, to what extent he has undermined international institutions, ignored international humanitarian law, completely led to the decline of the credibility of the United States, not just in terms of values and power, I mean, that has been destroyed a while ago, but it's also its influence and leverage, because we spent 15 months with the pretense that Biden is really pushing Netanyahu to stop the war, to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza, but he's not listening. I mean, it's just like, this has many implications. First of all, I mean, this is breaking US laws, because there was obvious and credible documented accounts about the violations that happened in Gaza because of the war. I mean, like the Israel's attack and the IDF operations in Gaza, and well, later on we can, like, I think safely say genocide. And despite all this, there wasn't ever a serious move to, first of all, respect US laws, because by US laws, we should have suspended arms to Israel. And he undermined the ICC when the arrest warrants got out, and he said, like, this is outrageous and we stand by Israel. I mean, now we're going to see, I mean, Trump sanctioning actually probably the members of the ICC. I mean, are they so much different? Maybe Trump is like violent at the end of the day. He uses economic power as a violent tool, a tool of coercion and sanctions in that way, which will completely undermine the work and the credibility of the ICC, which is the same outcome that, I mean, we had by Biden. Again, I made the disclaimer at the beginning that does not to say that they are the same. There's so many different issues, but we need to look at things for what they are really. And again, like the whole point about the respect for international humanitarian law is a suggestion for the United States. Because look at how they abused the power and the number of times they vetoed any attempt to reach a resolution for ceasefire. So these were all things that have been happening. And one thing that I feel like I've been thinking about when Shibley was saying is like he's the most uninformed president. I think one of the things that Trump does is just like he kind of exposes himself and exposes everyone around him. Although, I mean, in past 25 years in my career, and I've met a lot of Western policymakers who were incredibly uninformed about the Middle East. At least, I mean, I come from Egypt originally, and I mean, encountered many, I would say, dangerously uninformed policymakers. And that really is not just because you know how to speak policy and you have your PhDs and all those credentials mean that you understand. And just one example, just like weeks before October 7th, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said that the Middle East has not been in a moment that is that peaceful. I'm not like copying verbatimly, but this is what he said. Someone is not just that he was not able to predict, he's not able to read and understand. And this is like the uninformed moment that, like, or the uninformed view. And these are not just an issue of predicting and seeing. No, there are consequences to that. There are deals and treaties that is sort of based on that. For example, the Abraham Accords, which is basically the biggest, I mean, most obvious evidence of how uninformed, I mean, and I'm being generous when I say uninformed, because I mean, like, there are other ways to see it. So thinking that you're going to have those arms deals with Arab states who were not at war with Israel to begin with, to have the peace, I mean, the Abraham Accords is like, it's the same basic version of like arms for peace. This is the foundation of the Abraham Accords. And also thinking by doing that, somehow the Palestinian issue is going to disappear. And we're not going to talk about. This is also, I mean, just like, it's not about being unable to predict, it's unable to read. It's an analytical failure, not a failure to predict. So this is.
I mean, something drawing what both of you got at is not necessarily that Trump is a break from decades of U.S. foreign policy, but actually that there's more continuity in Trump's policy, both the first, Trump 1.0 and 2.0, than I think a lot of people in Washington might want to admit. I mean, I thought this just the other day as I was watching the press conference between Trump and Netanyahu, and I was thinking, wow, where have I seen this before? It's an American president, an Israeli prime minister determining the future of the Palestinian people without any Palestinians in the room. That sounds pretty much like U.S. policy toward the Middle East for the past several decades. And again, going from, the first Trump administration into Biden campaigned on human rights. He campaigned promising to make Saudi Arabia a pariah. He made a whole set of commitments, elevating principles and values in U.S. foreign policy, and just methodically abandoned pretty much every single one of those commitments, and ended up shortly with a policy in the region, if not everywhere in the world, because I think there are definitely some differences, but certainly in the Middle East, that was not very different, I think, from Trump's. But I want to look at the region as it is today. In the wake of the October 7 attacks and the war on Gaza, and I think the Abraham Accords were of a moment, because as Nancy said, I mean, the logic of this was that the U.S. was going to cut deals with these undemocratic, unrepresentative regimes. We're going to push the Palestinian issue over to the side, create this kind of regional consortium to confront Iran, but also the part of this logic, especially for the Biden administration, was to try and box China out of the region, because if you haven't noticed, competition with China has become the new obsession in Washington. It's the lens through which all of foreign policy is now seen. So it served several purposes there, but the Middle East of today, I think, is quite different from the Middle East of January 2021. So Shibley, I think Trump and his team do have some assumptions about how they can kind of pick up where they left off, but I think those assumptions are incorrect.
Yeah, I think, first of all, let me just sort of introduce a little nuance onto this. It's the same.
That's not allowed.
It's not the same. It isn't the same, really. I mean, yes, American policy has been inconsistent, and there were lots of failure, particularly on Israel-Palestine, where it was an aberration to many positions the U.S. has taken historically, whether it's Democratic or Republican presidents. But he really is a unique figure, and what he's introducing is something unprecedented. The extent to which he's liberated from considering any input from anyone, any agency of government. And part of the reason why he's going after agencies of government is that he wants loyalists and yes people around him. The extent to which there is likely to be less pushback. Every president has been sensitive to some degree to pushback from national security establishment, from people around them, from advisors, from world leaders, and the extent to which he wings it on his own out of his head, and then he doesn't backtrack. And the extent to which he's challenging, look at what's happening domestically. Can we say this is the same as usual? This has never happened before. So I think that let's keep that in perspective. He is something unique, even aside from some continuity in American foreign policy. if I look at the Middle East broadly, particularly after the Gaza war and the Israel-Lebanon war, obviously those arenas remain fragile, and there will be, kind of the immediate issues. But the bigger issue, of course, that is going to force itself on to on the forefront of his agenda is Iran. And that's really what people were looking at, because obviously there is not a secret that the Prime Minister of Israel would like to have the U.S. join him in attacking Iran's nuclear facility militarily. There is no question. He's done that. He's tried to do it many times in the past. Americans resisted. And by the way, the reason why Barack Obama pursued the Iran nuclear deal in the second term as a top priority was because he understood that if he didn't have that, this is the only issue that could drag the U.S. into a war he didn't want to happen. And it was a war prevention strategy. And I happen to have advised that administration early on. It was a war prevention strategy. He understood that. And Trump, with all his flaws, in the first term, he clearly didn't want to be dragged into a major war. And the last year, when Netanyahu tried to have feelers to see if he could join him on war, he rejected it. He didn't want to do it. And right now, obviously, is a different moment, because you could make it, I could imagine Netanyahu making the case, look, Iran has been weakened dramatically after we hit them, and after they lost, after their ally Hezbollah is weakened, and they're closer to a nuclear weapon, and so forth, and therefore now is a good opportune moment to do it. What Trump has been signaling, and not just Trump, but some of the people around him, they're obviously, he listens to a lot of, he sort of listens, I should say, to some core advisors around him, and not necessarily experts. Like he listens, for example, to Tucker Carlson, apparently, who is clearly not in favor of war. J.D. Vance, the vice president, also had stated early on that he doesn't support, he doesn't think it's in America's interest to be dragged into a war, even if Netanyahu wants it. These are all very pro-Israel people. It's not a question of not supporting Israel, but they think that there's at least some differentiation between America's interest toward Iran and Israel's interest toward Iran, that they want to do it. So the key question was whether this propensity by Trump himself, bolstered by some people he respects, would then act as a way of preventing Netanyahu from persuading him to join the war with Iran. And what we now see is, I'm not sure that that assumption necessarily can be fulfilled for two reasons. One is, think about the idea of American forces going into Gaza. I mean, if you are going to avert a war, be dragged into another war in the Middle East, and you're proposing out of the blue to go into a war, let's remember, Israel is the most powerful army in the Middle East, one of the most powerful armies in the world. It had total support in terms of equipment and intelligence and backing by the most powerful army in the world. It fought for 15 months in Gaza and couldn't defeat Hamas next door. Just put that in perspective. So this is not exactly a walk through the park if you think you're going to just. And he's proposing this recklessly, right? Recklessly, I say that again, because again, if you're trying to not be drawn into a war, why would you want to do that? And so the question in my mind has always been, is he going to be trapped by his own rhetoric on Iran, where he will say, I will prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, but I want to do it through sanctions, tough sanctions, and then negotiations. He'll find that tough sanctions alone will not work. I mean, it's been tried before to persuade Iran without giving them something in return. It's not going to work. And so what happens then? And particularly as you have more and more reports saying they're closer and closer, and you've seen some over the past 2 weeks about presumed shortcut to nuclear weapons that Iran has. So despite all of that, therefore, Matt, to put it straightforward, despite all of the brakes on him perhaps to be drawn into war with Iran, I do not preclude it at this point. And I think that could in a way overwhelm everything else. That's number one. So, that could really read. The second point is about normalization with Saudi Arabia. Clearly, they read the Abraham Accords as a success, as a crown jewel of the first administration. By the way, in our forthcoming book, co-authored book, we have a lot on that and a lot of interesting nuances as to how and why it happened. But the bottom line in this particular case is they see that the crown jewel now for Trump would be to have a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Trump said in his comments that he doesn't think that the Saudis will demand a Palestinian state. He said they haven't been demanding a Palestinian state. And I think that immediately the Saudis issued a harder statement than they had issued before they kind of nuanced it this time, said not only before progress toward a Palestinian state, before there is a Palestinian state in their statement. So they contradicted them immediately. So I think at the moment, what you find is that you're going to have a, kind of a momentum in the Arab world that is going to go possibly even against this crown jewel of his in a way that he may not have anticipated. He says he knows otherwise. My sense is that the people who are messaging him are the people who are giving him that impression. And my sense is also when he says, everybody loves my plan. I mean, I don't know if you've all listened to him after putting forth his plan on Gaza just a couple of days ago. You look at the worldwide condemnation of the plan, worldwide condemnation. The only party that has really applauded is the far right in Israel. And he says, everybody loves my plan. And you have to wonder what it is that everybody loves my plan. Partly it's Trump, because everything he does is just like, I've got the biggest crowd, I've got the biggest whatever. It is what he wants to project. He says what he wants people to believe. That's number one. But it's more than that, because in this particular case, he surrounds himself with a bubble, and that bubble is probably giving him that reinforcement and not listening to anybody else that's coming from the outside. That is my fear about he's going to conduct his policy on these big issues.
Yeah, before we go to Nancy, I just want to, I appreciate your response initially to my point about Trump and is there continuity or not, but I do want to clarify, yes, obviously Trump is a unique and a uniquely dangerous figure in a lot of ways, there's no question, but I think especially during the first term, there was a tendency to treat him as such an anomaly in a way that kind of excused us from seeing the ways in which he actually is a product of a status quo, more than a break from the status quo. You know, he just takes the existing corruption of American politics and turns it up to 11, you know, and in foreign policy, many in the non-Western world have always seen the so-called rules-based order essentially as a kind of mafia protection racket. And that's how Trump treats it explicitly. That's how he understands American power. If you want to be part of the club, you need to pay up. I mean, you listen to him talk about NATO, he seems to think that, you know, NATO countries actually pay the United States. I don't think he really understands how NATO works, but it's like if you want to be a made guy and protected and be part of the protection racket, you pay upstairs. So again, I think it is important. Again, there's no question now he won clearly this time. This is not an anomaly. This is a real trend. He is a real figure in American politics and American history. So I think there's an opportunity to perhaps look a bit more clearly in the at those trends that kind of created Trump, in which he is continuing to build on. Nancy, you know, going to what Shibley said about the Abraham Accords now, I do kind of want to talk about how the region is different now than as it was previously. We traveled together, Nancy and I, just a few weeks ago in Israel and Palestine. We happened to be there when the ceasefire agreement came together. Very interesting, to say the least, talking with Palestinian and Israeli colleagues as that came together, but also hearing from them about what they expect. The Saudi normalization deal came up in a lot of conversations. But I do think, I mean, perhaps ironically, the weakening of Iran, weakening of Hezbollah, Iran is much more on the back foot, I think, right now, which also perhaps makes the Saudis less anxious about signing the deal. Right now, what do you think?
Well, certainly the Middle East is looking so different than what it was, I mean, before October 7th, and definitely so different than 2003. I mean, when like you can go and invade a country and just like claim victory and just like walk away and after winning it. And the regional dynamics also have changed a lot, like most recently in Syria, for example, and I'll get to that. But one of the things that is a bit problematic when we look at the region, and particularly when we look at Israel and Palestine, we always tend to see it as a bilateral conflict. And it's not. It was, and to an extent, of course. I mean, this is an occupation, a very special, form of repression and violation and all this. But it's more of a symptom of a larger problem of the region. And it's a symptom of looking at the support for oppressive regimes that control the population. And this is how the United States has been looking at the Middle East for a long time. It's a threat that needs to be contained. This is how most of the foreign policy directions have been looking at the region in that way, with the exception of 2011 and the beginning of the Arab Spring. Now, looking at Trump's view and thinking this is like, there's some sort of arrogance of saying is like, oh, we're going to reshape the Middle East because, I mean, just because, I mean, they had a ceasefire thinking this is the moment to just like reset the table and as if you have full control. And also it's like one of the things is like the United States has an inflated sense of influence. They do, but they don't use it when it's necessary. But when you look at Trump in particular, and you look at his nominations, for example, it says a lot about his thinking about the Middle East. And particularly one of the most interesting nominations, I mean, it's like, people thought it's like, Huckabee as an ambassador is like, this says a lot. And I mean, it's like the direction of that, but not really. I mean, like the real telling nomination is Steve Witkoff, who is a real estate billionaire, never worked in politics, his Trump's golf buddy. And this represents everything about Trump. I mean, like, first of all, he prioritized loyalists. He doesn't believe in experience and understanding and expertise of politics. He thinks you can solve any problem by throwing money at it. And his perspective of the Middle East, and as Witkoff himself, when he was asked, is like, what do you think about the nomination? He said, this is one giant real estate opportunity, because this is how they see it. But this is not new. And I think Matt also had a piece in Foreign Policy yesterday, like mentioning is like, this is not a novel idea for him. Jared Kushner had mentioned that already before. And this was like sort of the essence also of the deal of the century. It's like the understanding you can just go build resorts and buildings and communities, and that's going to solve the problem. And with all this, the Arab populations are completely out of the equation. I mean, it's just like they're not, well, first of all, I mean, like they don't think of us, the people with agency or influence, and we don't matter. And I had an interesting encounter, just to go back to how the Middle East is changing. It was like a week before Thanksgiving last year, and I was like having a panel talking, saying the same things. And it's like my co-panelist says like I think it's about time to stop talking about human rights and change and all this. I mean, like it fails. Look at Assad. He prevailed. He is now being accepted everywhere and normalized and rehabilitated and going to the Arab leagues. That 4 days before Assad fell. This is like telling about how the inability of people to really understand the region, really understand. I'm not saying it's like what happened in Syria is like completely like people power alone or people power. I mean, like there are different players that had a hand in this, but at the end of the day, you cannot continue to have a sustainable policy towards the Middle East while you factor out the people. And this is one of the reasons why Mohammed bin Salman is like, every time there are the outrageous claims like Trump made, I mean, like he goes on and he has to put out a statement that says, it's like, no, it means like we are adamant and firm with a Palestinian state, but this is more for public consumption. This is mainly for the people. It's just like, no, we're not gonna like sell out the Palestinians. But when you come to the details of it, and Matt and I mean, maybe Matt can elaborate on this a little bit, it was always like, yes, there can be a Palestinian state, but less than a state, not really a state, with no army, with no like sort of real independence. And also their idea of claiming and putting the tag of the Palestinians have the right to self-determination. And then when you come to it and just like even see the discussions about who's going to govern Gaza, every like one of them, like the leaders, is like having their own demands. I mean, the Israelis don't want the PA, the Saudis want a reform PA, they don't want to have Hamas as part of it, and really dictating how things are going to be and call it self-determination of the Palestinians.
Yeah, just maybe one question more before we go out to some questions from the audience. Like, Shibley, you mentioned that statement, I think it was 4 a.m. local time from the Saudis who responded immediately to Trump's remarks. We've seen responses from the Egyptian government, from the Jordanian government in response to the Gaza plan. What do you make of the regional response? And I say, let's be clear, we're talking about the governments, but also what have we heard from activists and other members of civil society in the region about Trump's policy thus far?
Well, first of all, let me preface this a little bit because, I mean, I understand why people are suspicious of what Arab leaders say. And there is truth to some of the statement that sometimes all it is pacifying the public, and behind the scenes, sometimes they say something else. And
we have that too here, you know.
Yes, it's everywhere. But the reality of it is, of course, they're mostly interested in staying in power, and very often they swallow hard and go along. If you look at the 2003 Iraq War, where everyone was privately saying, "Don't do it; it's crazy. It'll be detrimental to us and you," and then U.S. goes in and then they fall in line. So, I mean, there is this assumption. I remember at one point during getting ready for the Iraq War, I was part of a small group that went to meet with the Condoleezza Rice, and she said, "Oh, they'll all fall in line once they know we're serious." And this was like, it's not about even just consulting with them or listening to them. Don't take them seriously. Basically, they'll all fall in line once they know we're serious, and that's kind of the attitudes, and then that goes beyond Trump himself. So I want to preface that. So there's some truth to it. It's not completely outrageous proposition. The problem right now is it has, I think, become more of an existential threat, certainly for Jordan. The idea that Jordan can absorb any more Palestinian refugees and stay and survive the Israeli far-right claim that Jordan is Palestine, because you could see what's coming on the West Bank. It's kind of like impossible to envision. That's why the king is, you could see him scrambling all of his coming. He just, I think, may have just arrived in the U.S. He's going to be meeting with Trump on the 11th. The Egyptians, the same thing. I think that, we can discuss sort of the Egyptian issue here beyond the moral or the Arab dimension and the caring about Palestinians the Egyptian public has. It's dramatic, tremendous. I mean, think about this. So Egypt and Israel have had a peace treaty, since 1979. And it's still called a cold peace because despite the fact that it held at the government-to-government level and military-to-military level, the Egyptian people are still rejecting normalization without the Palestinian issue being resolved. So there's a dramatic, deep caring across the board, public care, regardless of what the government does. But it is a threat to the regime as it sees it itself, because, I mean, they see that infusion of Palestinian refugees, particularly given the history they've had with Gaza when Gaza was under Egyptian control, to be a national security threat. And ECC actually said that, they used the term, it's a national security threat. So you have those two really major neighbors, both of which have a peace treaty with Israel, that now see it as a threat. And clearly they're allied with the Saudis and the UAE, particularly in this particular case. And the Saudis themselves have their own public opinion that has already been mobilized by what happened in Gaza over the past year and a half, to the extent that they've changed at least the way they're talking about the issue and applied the brakes on symbols of normalization. So I think on the incentive for them to be more serious this time, that this is not just running around, the Arab League making a statement, they're making a statement. I think there's something bigger going on. Whether or not this will lead to something practical that would impact Trump, I don't know. And that's because, if I'm looking at it from the point of view of the quote Trump plan, I don't want to really kind of legitimize it because it is so utterly immoral and illegal that just to say, here's why it's not practical is sort of like legitimizes it almost by virtue of analyzing the practical implications of it. And I worry about that being dragged into that kind of discourse. But when you think about it, you think about, the fact that it's not going to fly militarily. But the U.S. isn't going to send any military troops right now to take over Gaza. And so the only thing that's going to do is, if Israel wants to resume the war in the name of implementing the Trump plan, because now you have to say Israel is going to hand it over to us. You've seen people saying Israel will hand it over to us after they take control. Then essentially the plan is, what they're planning is just legitimizing the agenda of the far right of taking over, occupying, and displacing Palestinians. So that's going to be the most important impact. Is not so much that the U.S. itself will be dragged into that. And that's going to, again, reignite our public opinion. That's going to further fuel what the kind of things that I just talked about. So I don't know how the Arabs will play it, but I think it's a new game for them. They take it far more seriously because it impacts their sense of survival, their sense of national security.
Respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I fully agree with everything you said. I mean, this is like particularly for President Sisi, it is indeed an existential threat. And the first time around when they had the deal of the century on the table, and the idea was also to have like a border of Gaza be is like sort of inhabited and have just factories and businesses where Palestinians would come for a work visa per day and then go back. I mean, the Egyptian military and the Egyptian intelligence did everything in their power to stop that. Not because of, the rights of the Palestinians. It is that existential threat. Because first of all, like the whole history and the blood and war and everything is just like for bringing back Sinai and all this and the history also in the culture of the Arab people is like the Palestinian cause itself. And they were like, we will not allow this to happen because this is a threat, as Shibley said, is like it is an existential threat. It's not like anything else, because one time we had this argument on with one of the US officials, and Mao was there, and was like discussing like the impact of having this Saudi deal, and it's like the impact of the Arab world, and it's like, and the argument back is like, oh, but Camp David and the peace with Jordan happened above people's heads, and nothing happened. And this is what they think. This is like, oh, it happened before. I mean, completely ignored the will of the people, because those people are not governed by people, leaders who represent them. And it can go away, but it's not that simple. And they realize this. It's also, I think, I would be really surprised if the Israelis, I mean, like, apart from the far right, would think that this is a good idea. Because a changed Egypt, I mean, if what Sisi, I mean, expects as like kind of like the change that is going to happen with, I mean, Palestinians going and merging with activists in Egypt, or the different formats of the threat that they have, there's like the stability that they're having. That's not, I mean, from the Israeli perspective, an ideal situation that they would prefer. So.
Great. Love to get some questions from the audience, and I know we've spent a lot of time focusing on the Gaza comments and the Israel and Palestine, but obviously there's a whole range of other issues: the conflict in Sudan, Turkey's new role post fall of Assad, Iran. So just a few requests. Just if you could keep your questions relatively short, and please do put your questions in the form of a question. So, sir.
Thank you for a wonderful panel. Once you step outside of the U.S. bubble, traveling abroad, it seems
Yeah,
like
if you wouldn't mind, just you introduce yourself if you could.
Sure. Nariman Safavi, a local resident of the area. I also sometimes do commentary on WBZ, NPR station of Chicago. When you step outside of the United States, it seems like Israel considers one of the sources of its soft power to be its lobby, that it actually tries to advertise itself, that if you want to have the greatest superpower, United States, do something, convince it of something, you can come to us and we use our lobby to help formulate US policy. That has happened with countries like Saudi Arabia, with Azerbaijan, with India. The news of that hardly ever gets to the US media, that Israel uses that. Jeffrey Sachs has been lately talking about how Netanyahu fancies himself as the determinate factor of US foreign policy, that it can drag US into just about anything. But Matt, you were talking also about the obsession with China in Washington, D.C., which used to be called Pivot to Asia. And it seemed like when Pivot to Asia was coined by President Obama, Netanyahu was telling him, the hell with you, I'm going to drag you right back into the Middle East, which kind of dovetails with what Jeffrey Sachs is doing. So isn't the outcome of all of this is a perception that Israel basically determines American foreign policy? And can that pivot to Asia be exploited as a schism to kind of pose, to counter what Netanyahu is doing, saying that we need to focus on Asia right now?
If I may, I certainly wouldn't use the term determines. Clearly, that would be an overstatement. Israel has a lot of influence, but more importantly, a lot of people around the world think Israel has, maybe even determines, as you suggested. And in fact, I've written about this really more than 2 decades ago. This is not new. So in the beginning of normalization, particularly after Camp David between Israel and Egypt, I wrote, I used to say in my writings, that Arab rulers and many around the world think that the shortest way to Washington goes through Tel Aviv. So that was kind of an axiomatic. If you really want to get close to people in D.C., line yourself up with Israel, and they'll help you reach the people you want to reach in Congress and elsewhere. That was definitely common wisdom, and it might still be common wisdom in the sense of, part of what perhaps drove the UAE to do what it did, or the Saudis to do what it did, because the aim is not really to get closer to Israel as much as it is to go closer to America. So yeah, there is that perception. Whether it's true or not, or the extent to which it's true is something else that we can debate or whatever. But that's certainly something of a perception. And that perception is going to be stronger now, in part because the breaks that we're seeing on American policy globally were supposed to emanate from enduring American institutions of national security that weighed in, whether it was the CIA or the DOD or the State Department or all the agencies of government that have experts in relationship that are enduring and that tried to protect certain things over time. And now these are all under assault. Either they come online, come in line with policy, or are being seemingly dismantled. So I think that, yeah, that's going to definitely be a thing. But what you said about particularly global politics, I come from a realist school for international politics. My mentor at Berkeley when I did my PhD was Kenneth Waltz, who was, one of the great neo-realists in the American debate. And one of the things about power that I learned very early on is that when at some point states prefer to balance rather than bandwagon, by which what is meant is that if in a global system where there's more than one big power, a state that feels threatened is less likely to just bandwagon behind the threatening superpower and more likely to balance against it. We've had a vacuum in international since the end of the Cold War. Obviously, the U.S. has been the dominant power globally. And in a way, people didn't have an alternative, if you wish, if they wanted to kind of, they were so invested in the relationship that they couldn't balance. There is no option for real balancing in international relations. China is obviously emerging as a balancer, and obviously Washington sees it that way. And there is no question in my mind that China is the biggest winner in the global picture now as people reassess. Whether or not they will exercise that power, I don't know. Whether or not they have the capacity beyond their economic power to exercise kind of that power, I don't know. But there is definitely, I think, a new dynamic that's going to be more visible in the coming years.
About this for
Well, I mean, a couple thoughts on what you said. I mean, clearly, the Israel lobby has considerable influence in American politics. And when we talk about the Israel lobby, we should understand that in terms of sheer numbers of voters, the biggest part of the Israel lobby are American evangelicals. This is the community I come from. So I really think it's important to understand for cultural and political, religious reasons, this is part of the reason why it is a unique and special relationship in a lot of ways. And that relationship has put to some pretty destructive ends, certainly. That's happening now. But when we talk about the relationship and the influence that goes on, I think it's important to note that. Benjamin Netanyahu says a lot of things about himself. I'm sure he would like people to believe that he is the determinant of American foreign policy. He's very good at doing his own PR. Clearly, he's someone who's very effective at managing his own domestic politics and in intervening in America's domestic politics. He's a very smart guy. But sometimes I think that overestimating the influence that he or other Israeli leaders have on American foreign policy is a way of letting American foreign policymakers off the hook. They are good, as many client states are good at saying, do what we want you to do, and that's a way to sustain American power and American primacy. And this is something we see right now. This was part of the logic of the Abraham Accords, like do this, cut these deals, and you'll sustain American hegemony. And the problem is not necessarily these particular governments. It's the frantic sustaining of American hegemony and of American power. So I think that is the challenge of challenging that preconception to make it less vulnerable to that kind of influence, as I see it.
I think I'm going to step in and moderate here because clearly we need to benefit from all of your expertise. Questions? Yes. I've seen the other hands, so I know where to go next.
Thank you so much for the moderator talk. I'm an undergraduate student. My question was about distraction, because I think when we think about Trump's domestic policies, right, like within the first 10 days, a flurry of this executive order, this and that, and some of the things are like, there's no way that, you can't really end birthright citizenship by an executive order. That's just not really something that's going to happen, but this executive order can actually do something. And there's this thing about if you do 10 crazy things, but 5 of them actually take effect, you can't concentrate on all 10 things, right? The media can only concentrate on certain things. So I'm wondering, in terms of foreign policy, right? It is an insane proposition that probably won't happen to say Gaza will become a beachside property that we're going to develop, right? So what do you see distraction as a strategy being the Trump administration in foreign policy, where they say this cuckoo crazy thing, and then they do this other thing. They're both cuckoo crazy, but everyone looks at the thing that it's just like definitely not going to happen, but the other thing that is just as cuckoo crazy might as well happen.
Go ahead,
Can I
Nancy.
get this one? Yeah, maybe I think you're on point with that. And this was the expectation based first on the first Trump administration is like before, like when he was campaigning, is like he's gonna impose a Muslim ban, and if you just like ban all Muslims and all this, and in the first week of after his inauguration, he did implement the Muslim ban. I mean, I personally was affected by that. I was in London at that time, and I didn't know if I can go back to the United States or not because I didn't have a citizenship at that time. So it's just like he does things that like give this like shock impact. This time, he also learned from the first administration. One is that you do everything everywhere all at once, as they say. It's a strategy for distraction. And it also hard for people to follow. I mean, it's like, what is the outcome of everything? So if you look at like the major things he did, I mean, like, of course, the USAID issue and federal grants is a huge real problem. But when you think, for example, it was just like what he did with Colombia. I mean, the fact is, I mean, before Trump became president, there were 3 flights of immigrants that goes from the United States to Colombia already. And so what he settled on is like the way they are transformed and all this. And then he declared like they caved and they did what I wanted, which is not true. The same thing with Canada. I mean, again, like what they ended up agreeing to is what they already decided on December 17th of 2024. The same thing with Mexico. So, but I'm not saying that this is all like smokes and mirrors and is like nothing, because at the end of the day, perceptions matter. And the way that people perceive and fear, and Trump is an entertainer. I mean, like, this is his job. He knows how to attract crowd. He knows how to move people, and this is how, I mean, mainly one of the reasons like he won. And but it's not because they don't happen, they're not dangerous. They are. And this is the thing that it's on us, really. First of all, like, as to separate, I mean, the noise from the signal, as Matt was saying in a meeting this morning, and also, I mean, focus on that we cannot be, and this is what he wants, is like always just like trying to put off fire and be on the defensive and distracted, whereas what we need is actually build our own agenda and build our own community and direction, which did not happen, and part of why we lost. So I hope this answers.
Anything else on distraction, or should I move to another question? Okay.
I'll just say really quick, just for an example, with the Gaza proposal. I mean, the idea that we're going to send U.S. troops to Gaza, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. And he'll withdraw that. They're already saying as of yesterday, he's just putting that out there to produce other solutions. But the signal in this case is normalizing the idea of ethnic cleansing. That is what's really concerning. That's something he said before. That's what Israeli leaders have said they want to do. So normalizing this idea that giving them the opportunity to leave, and everyone understands what that means. The Palestinians certainly understand what that means, but making this a normal policy option is the signal here that I think we should focus on.
Hi, my name is Nastia. I'm an undergrad. And how does Lebanon and Hezbollah fit into Trump's plan to take over Gaza? And could that escalate into the war with Iran that Israel's been pushing?
Yeah, obviously the war between Israel and Hezbollah was in good part a function of the Gaza war, because Hezbollah took a lot of risks and they paid a heavy price for backing Hamas in Gaza, for sure, to take off. They weren't looking for a full war, but then when Israel wound down its operations in Gaza, essentially turned and did that. At the moment, there's a stalemate. There's no question in my mind that Hezbollah has been weakened as a consequence of the war with Israel. I think everybody would agree to that. They agree to that. I mean, they say they've been weakened. The question is whether they've been so weakened that they're unable to still put in a military option on the table in their relationship with Israel. Recall that when the ceasefire agreement was done, they were still firing almost as many missiles as they had been throughout the war. So their including missiles that hit Tel Aviv and the Tel Aviv vicinity at that time. So they still have capabilities. Everybody agrees with that. They still have the determination. Hezbollah also is not just a military force, right? It is the Shia community in Lebanon arguably is the largest single grouping of a multi-religious and ethnic distribution in Lebanon. So they're not going to go anyway. They're part and parcel of Lebanon. They're one of the most influential. So I don't think that in and of itself, that's going to draw that the Hezbollah is going to instigate a war with Israel. No matter what happens in Gaza. And yes, they do. Iran certainly is the patron and supplies them with weapons. And they make, sometimes they may be responding to Iranian requests, but often they're making their own decisions because they have their own game in Lebanon. I suspect that if in fact there is ethnic cleansing taking place on large scale, out of Gaza and out of the West Bank, in addition, that a lot of groups will be activated in the Middle East, including Hezbollah. It'd be impossible for them to maintain their raison d'etre and not act. And I think, in fact, part of the problem right now in what Trump said is how much he's activating the radical militants in the Middle East. I hope we don't see increasing attacks against Americans as a consequence. I fear it. So, yeah, I think it's a wild card. They're certainly not a destroyed group. Anybody who tells you that they don't know what's happening in Lebanon or to Hezbollah.
I'm keeping track of hands raised, and I'm going to go in order.
Liam Connell. I always have to ask a question at every event. I live in Lake Forest. I'm quite interested in the Middle East. I don't want to overemphasize their importance, but nobody's mentioned Europe and whatever European influence, if at all, exists. I do think that there's a significant cultural impact, but I'd like to get your opinion.
Sure, I'll say a few things. One is, first, I think getting back to how smart Netanyahu is, building a relationship early on with Orban and kind of dividing the EU and preventing the Europeans from speaking with any kind of consensus or unanimity, and more importantly, being able to act as a European Union to impose sanctions or any kinds of economic decisions, I think has made an enormous impact. It blunted a really important tool that the Europeans could have used to not just to put their kind of rhetoric and principles into actual material action. As we've seen, over the past 15 months of the Gaza war, Europeans still largely followed the U.S.'s lead, and you had a United States president who was where he was. no daylight, total support, almost completely unconditional support, behind the scenes pressure, we're told. And I think some of that was real, but it was not nearly enough. We have Ireland, which has long distinguished itself as an ally supporter of the Palestinians, now facing a very concerted effort to isolate and condemn what they've been saying. So I think this is the strategy. And so you have a lot of these countries as well, you know, UK, Germany, France, and others facing clearly their own threats from the far right, some of which have nothing to do with the Middle East. But, you know, this is, again, part of the Israeli rights strategy. Part of Netanyahu's, you know, tactic here in building these relationships is that he's the guy who can go out and give anti-Semitism waivers to these right-wing groups like the AfD. Like, I give you this stamp, you can say whatever you want. You can literally repeat Nazi propaganda, and I'll come out and tell you, oh, not an anti-Semite, like he did for Elon Musk, right? This guy does a Nazi salute, and the next day, Netanyahu's out saying, no, I'm not an anti-Semite. I mean, that's a valuable currency, and he uses it, you know, very, very frequently to sustain these alliances, because this kind of global far right project is very much a project he's been in the vanguard of as well.
If I may, you know, with Europe, I agree with everything that Matt said. But what I would say is that you know, the EU obviously is, you know, what do you mean by the EU? And every country has got its own foreign policy, more or less. So that's an issue that has never gone away, particularly with the diversity of governments that you have. I actually would focus more on what we have called the liberal international order, of which the EU played a very important part. And I think what I see, the damage that we've been observing over the past couple of decades is to the liberal international order as we've known it. We've talked about international order, the UN agencies, international human rights organizations, international legal organizations. The assault on the international order, I mean, look at this, this was completely obvious. There's no sense of illegality for what Trump was proposing at all. And that happened I would put forth the proposition that the Biden administration, first, obviously the first Trump administration did a lot of damage to the international order as we have known it, but Biden did even more damage to it. And they did more damage to it prior to Trump taking office, in large part because he was taking office in the name of a liberal Democratic president trying to defend and build on the liberal international order. And his initial support for Ukraine was entirely based on this argument. And I think the fact that you had a liberal Democratic president undermining the international order in that way, it also weakened the role of all the EU, because their strength is tied to what we have come to know as the liberal international order. And I think that is going to be the key global problem we face today.
Yeah, I'll just quickly agree. I mean, I think Biden, just by virtue of being such an adherent of, you know, the global international rules-based order, did far more damage than Trump ever could have, because Trump is a heretic. You know, he is not someone speaking from inside the church as Trump was, or as Biden was.
So we just have a few minutes left. I'd like to actually collect the questions at this point. So raise your hand if you've got one, and we'll get mics to you first over there. And then don't answer, we'll just collect the questions, then you can answer.
Okay, so my name is Roberto. I'm an historian of late Ottoman Palestine. I want to have three quick questions. One, your views about Mike Huckabee, particularly in relation towards policies towards the West Bank. Secondly, you only mentioned once J.D. Vance, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the potential forerunner in 2028. We know he's Catholic, recently converted, but obviously detached from the Vatican positions towards Palestine. And lastly, if you see any unintended consequences connected to Donald Trump statements, if there are emotions, you know, dynamics that are not necessarily connected, but already moving forward. Thank you.
Any other folks want to add to your three questions? Did you had your hand up before, Danny? Can you get, yeah.
Thanks so much for this rich discussion. I wanted to just follow up on something that you said, Nancy, in one of your responses. about the erasure of agency of people in the region. You were talking obviously about the complete lack of acknowledgement of the agency of Palestinians from Washington's perspective. But you also mentioned something very interesting about the fall of the Assad regime and how Assad's normalization very shortly before his fall was seen in many ways. And even I would add to that, that when Assad did fall, for a lot of people in the sort of the pro-Palestine movement and other, activists, intellectuals, and writers on the left, there was a kind of a range of reactions, many of which had nothing to do with how the people of Syria actually saw or felt about this historic event. It was much more about how is this going to affect, is this going to be good for Israel? Did Israel play a role in this? Is this going to be good for the US? Is this going to weaken the axis of resistance, quote unquote? So sorry, that was,
Get
I
to the
just would
question,
like
yeah.
you to elaborate a little bit on that.
And let me take the first one for two reasons. One is that I'm actually writing a book called Evangelicals, Politics, and Israel.
So many books,
and
Shibley.
and the second reason is because it ties to the comments I made about the liberal and international order. Yes, there's no question that, first of all, I happen to think I have a different take on the role of the evangelicals. I think they're cheerleaders rather than quarterbacks of policy toward Israel. They're essential cheerleaders. They're very important, but I don't think they're running the show on
Well,
this.
I don't disagree. I'm just saying
No,
they
no,
are
I
the
don't.
actual.
No, no, I
voting
did say you
base. Yeah,
disagreed.
yeah.
I am not taking that issue. That you and I agree on this. We've talked about it because Matt himself is follows this issue extremely closely. I've actually learned from him on this issue in the past. The one question about what Netanyahu wants now, actually, you might want to read an article in Yediot Ahronot, the Israeli newspaper, as he was coming in. And one of the things on the agenda was to reinforce a, quote, a faith-based support for Israel. That is the argument, of course, Huckabee made the statement, essentially, God gave the land to the Jews. And so there is no argument here. And of course, God, who argues with God? I mean, the UN and international politics and rules, that's completely besides the point. And you could, kind of dispute that and so forth. But it's just the moving away from the ordinary appeal to international law and UN resolutions and sovereignty, norms and all of that stuff. That doesn't matter because it's a faith-based argument. So that is really, I think, a central theme. And that's why, of course, Netanyahu welcomed the appointment of Huckabee specifically on this because of this justification, rationalization of the support for Israel, for sure. And we're going to see a lot more of that, I think, take place.
Yeah, on the Huckabee, I mean, just a couple of things. I mean, I don't need to say too much about this, but obviously basing kind of, international relations and foreign policy on what God thinks or thought at one time. Because if you keep reading in the Bible, like other times God decided other things should happen to the Israelites, like being taken into captivity into Persia. I don't think that should happen, even though God thought that at one time. For Mike Huckabee, there's no relationship with Trump as far as I can tell. What we've heard is that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, his former press secretary, called up Trump and was like, my dad would love to be ambassador to Israel. And Trump was like, all right. I mean, honestly, it's tempting always to kind of, try and figure out what the policy is based on these nominations. But sometimes it's like, something like Hegseth. Trump saw him on Fox News and was like, that guy looks really good in that suit. I want to talk to him. So, it's part of how frightening it is. But clearly, Huckabee would not be there. So to agree, it's not going to be writing the policy, but he represents a constituency, not just Sarah Huckabee Sanders, but the evangelicals that Trump understood he needed to give something to.
Just really quickly on your last question and relates to the question of agency. Well, first of all, on the nominees, they are we need to differentiate between influence and representation. What they represent is like a sort of a label that is important for many reasons. I mean, like Shibley and Matt mentioned, but they are chosen because they are loyal. They will follow the direction of Trump, and they will not challenge him. I mean, another example is Marco Rubio himself, who's like a neocon, who's like completely, I mean, it's like known for policies that does not match what at least Trump campaigned for. I mean, he's someone who's like praising USAID and the importance of USAID and its role in the world. So I wouldn't put too much, I mean, emphasis on what they really represent, because the moment they will have any form of resistance to Trump, that they're going to go away, like we've seen in the first term. And actually, it is partly in Trump's strategy, like having a controversial person like Hegseth, I mean, to be the department. This is someone, if he gets fired, people are not going to cry on, but it gives him a buffer when he makes mistakes and blame it on others. And concerning the unintended consequences, of course, I mean, well, first of all, one consequence of like the hyperbolic statements that he makes is like over the past 2 days, everyone is just like talking about not occupying Gaza by the Americans, and people stop talking about stopping arms to Israel, which is the main issue. But we just like, you hype things up and get people talk about like the maximalist policy that we want to prevent, but actually there was like a credible demand that is important to stop that. So this is one unintended consequence. And the other unintended consequence in the region is, and not just in the region, it's just like the support for transnational repression and the repression of the people in the region. And this did not also happen with Trump, because historically, I mean, the existence of Israel has served authoritarian regimes in the region. It was like in Egypt, it's like we can't complain about domestic issues, but it's like we have an external enemy out there, even if we actually had a peace treaty with Israel. It's always like that external threat that we have to just, I mean, it overrules national security, overrules everything. And it's also, I mean, like it's a double message as well. I mean, like to the West and in Europe and in the US is like, don't talk to me about human rights. I mean, if that, and that's probably part in the conversation between the kind of pressure that is on Sisi and his like ability is just like, I need a carte blanche on what I can do. If you criticize me, this is what's going to happen, and you're going to see chaos in the region. I mean, and again, like we talked about this in Syria as well. I mean, it's just unfortunately, it's not just policymakers who just impose their views or uninformed views on the region, but also, I mean, pundits and observers and think tankers. It was like there was a time, it was like when we were in Syria and getting bombed, and people are talking about anti-imperialism and thinking the idea of mixing theoretical views about people in complete, I mean, divorced from the reality and divorced from the opinion of those people and what they need and what their demands are. And this has been a problem. And again, like, it's like, there's always this false dichotomy that is prevailing between anti-authoritarianism and anti-imperialism. You can be both. I mean, you don't have to be apologetic for Assad or President Xi in China in order to be anti-imperialist.
I think that's a great note to end on. Please join me in thanking our guests. Thank you so much. Please join us at other MENA events. We have a sign-up sheet to get on our listserv. We have our full calendar of events you can take a copy of. This event is being recorded and it'll be on our website, correct? Yes, so you can share it with friends and family. Thank you so much for coming.
So I turned it back.